The galaxy sealed humans in a quarantine zone. Now the Council fears their return. The treaty is dated 200 years ago. I have read it 400 times, not because I needed to memorize it. I memorized it at age 9. I kept reading it because I wanted to feel something other than cold fury every time I looked at it. I am transmitting this log from beyond the veil. Let that settle for a moment. Beyond it, on the other side, in the open galaxy that was declared off-limits to every human being 2 centuries before I was born. My name is Alara Voss. I am 31 years old. I am the commanding officer of the breach ship Perseverance, crew of 7. And as of 6 days ago, I am the first human being in recorded history to cross the galactic quarantine barrier that sealed our entire solar system like a jar with a lid screwed on too tight. Nobody knows we are here yet. That window is closing fast. Let me tell you how we got here. Let me tell you what they did to us, and let me tell you why the Galactic Council, sitting right now in their gleaming chamber on Varith Prime with their 17 species and 10,000 years of interstellar law, should be very, very concerned about the next message they receive. 203 years ago, a human deep space probe made contact with an alien vessel near the edge of the solar system. The crew of that probe, 4 people named Carter, Lynn, Obasi, and Holloway, did exactly what they were trained to do. They attempted communication. They shared data. They offered medical records, mathematical sequences, music files, and a short video of a dog chasing a ball on a beach. The alien vessel belonged to a species called the Drenathi. The Drenathi were one of the founding members of the Galactic Council, an interstellar governing body representing 32 intelligent species. They were old, organized, and deeply set in the way they believed the universe should work. The Drenathi brought the data back to the Council. The Council studied humanity for 11 years without ever making direct contact. They watched our broadcasts. They read everything we had sent into space. They ran models on our behavioral patterns, our history, our biology, our decision-making. Then they voted. The verdict was not that we were dangerous in a military sense. We had no interstellar ships at that point. We had no weapons that could threaten anyone beyond our own atmosphere. The verdict was something far more unsettling. The Council classified humanity as a class Omega, unpredictable species. The formal definition, which I can recite without blinking, states a species whose adaptive and improvisational capacity cannot be reliably modeled, whose behavioral trajectory defies standard galactic developmental frameworks, and whose integration into the galactic community presents an unquantifiable risk to established order. Unquantifiable risk, that was their phrase for us. Not violent, not hostile, just impossible to predict. And to the Council, that was worse. The veil went up 14 months later. It covered the entire solar system. Quantum resonance barrier, self-sustaining, maintained by a relay network of 700 drones placed at calculated intervals along its boundary. Nothing could leave. Automated supply ships came in on a scheduled cycle every 8 years, carrying materials the Council had determined we needed to survive without dying off entirely. They wanted us contained, not extinct. Even that mercy had a political calculation behind it. Carter, Lynn, Obasi, and Holloway never came home. Their probe was redirected to a council archive facility. The council sent a formal message to Earth, explaining the situation. It arrived 3 weeks after the veil went up. There was nothing anyone could do. I have that message memorized too. It ends with the phrase, "This action is taken in the interest of galactic stability and the Council wishes humanity a peaceful and prosperous future within its designated zone." Designated zone, our solar system, our birthplace, our entire known universe, with a fence around it. I grew up reading that message. Every child in my generation did. It was not taught as history, it was taught as a wound, something you carried, something you did not forget. My mother was a physicist. Her name was Diana Voss, and she spent 40 years of her life inside the Breach Corps, a division of Earth's unified science authority whose single purpose was to understand the veil and find a way through it. She never stopped working. She was 72 years old when she went to sleep one night and did not wake up. She died 3 months before we crossed. I keep a sealed case on my left wrist. It has been there for 3 months. I have not opened it yet. Not yet. The veil was not simply a physical barrier. That was the first thing my mother's generation got wrong about it. Early attempts to breach it by force produced nothing except expensive equipment losses. The veil did not push back like a wall. It absorbed, it redirected. You aimed a concentrated energy beam at it, and the beam bent away like water around a stone, dispersed harmlessly into background radiation. You accelerated a probe at it, and the probe simply stopped, its systems intact, its crew unconscious for 8 hours, waking up on the interior side with no memory of impact and no explanation for what had happened. It was not a lock you could pick, it was something stranger. But the Council made one miscalculation. They assumed that sealing humanity away would slow us down, that without access to galactic resources and galactic knowledge we would develop at a reduced rate, that the humans they contained in year 0 of the quarantine were roughly the humans they would find if they ever opened the veil again, just older, a little more advanced, but recognizably the same. They were wrong in a way that I think is going to take them a very long time to process. I am transmitting this log because someone needs to know what is coming before it arrives, and I am the only one who can send it from out here. The Council sealed us in. They made us a crucible, and they have no idea what we cooked. It is difficult to explain 200 years of human history in a way that captures what it actually felt like from the inside. I will try. The first generation after the seal went up was defined by one emotion: disbelief, not panic, not rage. Disbelief. The idea that the galaxy had decided without asking, without warning, without any conversation at all, to lock 8 billion human beings inside their own solar system was so large and so strange that most people could not fully hold it in their minds. It felt like being told the sky was a ceiling and the stars were painted on. The second generation was defined by grief. By then the reality had settled. The ceiling was real, the stars were not painted on, but they were unreachable. This generation produced some of the most extraordinary art in human history. It also produced the first serious political movement centered not on escaping the veil, but on learning to Live as if it did not matter. This was called the inward doctrine, and for about 40 years it was influential. It argued that the galaxy had done us a favor, that internal development was more valuable than expansion, that we should stop looking outward and start building something worth looking at. The inward doctrine was not entirely wrong. And GT snorts. And GT, but it was not entirely right either. And by the third generation, it had been quietly set aside. The third and fourth generations were defined by anger, not disbelief, not grief, but a focused, productive, very human kind of anger that tends to produce results. This was the era of accelerated engineering without access to alien materials, without the possibility of trade. Humanity began solving its own problems at a pace that startled even the scientists doing the solving. Fusion power was fully stabilized in year 64 of the quarantine, 40 years ahead of pre-seal projections. Advanced materials were developed from first principles, some of which have no equivalent in any alien catalog I have since been able to access. The food production systems built during this period could sustain a population of 30 billion in the solar system without any additional resource input. I want to be clear about something. None of this happened because humanity became more unified overnight. It did not. The decades between year 40 and year 90 of the quarantine included 4 major regional conflicts, 2 near collapses of the global coordination system, and 1 period called the Long Disagreement, during which 15 separate governments refused to cooperate with each other for 11 years. This period ended not because anyone won or lost, but because of viral respiratory illness swept through 12 of those 15 governments in the same season, and they needed each other's medical infrastructure to manage it. Necessity, as it has always done, produced cooperation where philosophy had failed. By year 100, humanity had a unified planetary government. It was not elegant, it was not the idealized structure political theorists had been designing for centuries. It was a rough, functional, argument-filled system that made decisions slowly and implemented them fast. It was, in other words, deeply human. And then there was the breach core. The breach core was formally established in year 87 of the quarantine by coalition of physics institutes, originally funded as a theoretical research division. Its mandate was simple on paper: understand the veil. But its actual purpose, which everyone involved understood and no official document ever stated directly, was to get through it. My mother joined the breach corps at age 24, 3 years after finishing her doctorate in resonance field dynamics. She was assigned to a team studying the veil's behavioral responses to various stimuli. Their early work confirmed what previous attempts had shown: the veil did not respond to force in any predictable way, but it did respond. There were patterns in how it absorbed and redirected energy, very faint ones, easily dismissed as noise. My mother did not dismiss them as noise. She spent 9 years cataloging those patterns. She published 3 papers on her findings. 2 were well received. 1 was criticized heavily for what her colleagues called an overreach in interpretation. She never stopped investigating. What she found slowly over decades of work was that the veil was not a machine. Machines follow fixed rules. The veil had preferences. It responded differently to different kinds of energy. Inputs. It was more resistant to aggressive high-velocity approaches and less resistant to low-intensity, sustained frequency transmissions. It was, her final published paper, argued, a construct built from a form of quantum resonance that behaves analogously to biological response systems, not alive in any sense a biologist would recognize, but not simply mechanical either. It was, she wrote, something that could be communicated with if you spoke the right language. She spent 20 years after that paper looking for the right language. I was born into the breach core. Literally, my parents met there. My first memory is of sitting in my mother's lab while she ran frequency tests, the low hum of the equipment, the background, a cup of tea going cold on her desk because she kept forgetting it was there. I learned to read from her research notes. I took my first pilot training at age 14 on a modified supply ship in the inner asteroid belt. By the time I was 20, I had more hours in space than most officers twice my age. I was not the most technically brilliant person in the breach corps. There were minds there that made me feel slow on my best days, but I had something that proved to be as important. I did not stop. The breakthrough came in year 196 of the quarantine. I was 29, my mother was 71. Her final team, which included 8 physicists, 2 mathematicians, a linguist named Nora Caldwell, and an engineer named Peter Shaw, who could build anything from whatever was available, had developed a transmission protocol based on 12 years of accumulated frequency data. It was not a code, it was not a signal in the conventional sense. It was a pattern of resonance inputs designed to match the veil's own internal frequency signatures. Instead of pushing against it, they were proposing, in the only language it had, to have a conversation. The first test transmission lasted 4 minutes and produced no visible result. The second lasted 11 minutes and caused a 17 cm shift in the veil's surface density at the test point. I remember everyone in the room going completely silent. The third test lasted 48 minutes. At the end of it, a section of the veil, approximately the size of a large room, went completely transparent, not a hole, not a breach, transparent. We could see through it stars on the other side, the open galaxy, 200 years of impossible distance suddenly visible like a window in a wall we had stopped believing would ever open. Nobody moved for almost a minute. Then my mother sat down very carefully on the floor, put her face in her hands, and cried, not from sadness. She was not a person who cried from sadness often. She cried because she had spent 50 years working toward a moment, and the moment had arrived, and she needed somewhere to put all of it. I sat down next to her. We did not say anything. There was nothing adequate to say. 3 weeks later, I was given command of the Perseverance and a crew of 6. The 7th member joined at the last minute, which I will describe shortly. By then, my mother had been taken to the medical center with a cardiac event. She was stable. She was also 72 and had been running on 4 hours of sleep for the previous month. She died 11 days before we launched, not from the cardiac event. Her body had simply reached its limit. She was calm about it in a way that I found, and still find, very difficult to think about directly. She told me to scatter her somewhere. The Veil could not reach. I carry her on my wrist. I have not found the right place yet. We launched on a cold morning in March, 200 years and 8 months after the quarantine began. The veil opened for us exactly as my mother's team had shown it could. We passed through in 4 minutes and 37 seconds. On the other side, the Perseverance's external sensors lit up with data from a universe that no human instrument had measured in over 2 centuries. I sat in the command seat and looked at the readings for a long time. Then I opened my log and started recording. The galaxy thought sealing us in would diminish us. They were working from a model of development where isolation means stagnation. What they never accounted for was the particular way that humans respond to being told something is impossible. We do not accept it. We do not accommodate it. We find the problem underneath the impossibility and we work on it, quietly, persistently, without stopping, for as long as it takes. 200 years is a very long time to work on a problem. We are past the veil now, and we are just getting started. The Perseverance had been in open space for 22 days when we found the drone, or rather when it found us. I was in the navigation bay with my engineer Peter Shaw running trajectory calculations for a passage through the outer rim of the nearest charted star system when the proximity alert went off. Not an emergency alarm, a soft, consistent tone that meant something was nearby and moving toward us at a non-threatening speed. I went to the main display. A single vessel, automated from its energy signature, roughly 2 m in diameter, spherical with a surface pattern that matched no human design. It was sitting about 40 km off our starboard side, and it had matched our speed and heading exactly. It had been following us, and we had not noticed it for at least an hour. I looked at Nora Caldwell, who was standing in the doorway of the navigation bay holding a data pad and a cup of the truly terrible coffee she made every morning. Nora was the linguist. She was 44, calm by nature, and had the specific kind of unhurried intelligence that tended to be very useful when something unexpected happened. She looked at the display. She looked at me. She said, "Do you want to try talking to it?" I said yes. Nora had prepared for this. The breach core, despite never knowing exactly what form first contact beyond the veil would take, had spent 60 years developing a first contact communication package. It was built on the assumption that any spacefaring species would have enough mathematical foundation to recognize basic numerical sequences, geometric relationships, and signal patterns designed to indicate non-aggression. Nora had been refining this package for 11 years. She had 17 different versions of it, calibrated for different signal types, different bandwidths, different possible sensory frameworks. She picked version 4, mid-range, frequency, slow pulse rate, mathematically structured with a segment at the end that offered 17 different language roots in case any of them overlapped with something the drone system recognized. She transmitted for 6 minutes. The drone was silent for 40 seconds. Then it responded. The response was not communication in any sophisticated sense. It was an automated challenge signal, the kind of thing a monitoring system sends when it detects an anomaly. It was asking in its way who we were and why we were here. I know this because the signal Structure, once Nora translated it, was essentially a classification request. The drone was trying to file us in one of its existing categories. We did not fit any of them. It tried 3 more times over the next 20 minutes, sending different variants of the same basic query. Each time the structure changed, slightly, as if the system was scrolling through options. Each time Nora and I watched the patterns on the display, and Nora said things like interesting and there, look at that construction, and once quietly, they think in layers. On the 5th transmission, Nora did something that was not in the official protocol. She sent back a reply that was not a numerical sequence or a geometric relationship. It was a linguistic structure, very simple, a phrase in 17 languages that translated roughly to, "We would like to talk." The drone went silent for 11 seconds. I counted. Then it transmitted a single response. The word, once Nora had run it through every translation framework she had, came back as impossible. I felt something shift in my chest when she read that out. Not fear, not anger. Something closer to recognition. I had heard that word before in a different context, in a different language. It was the same word the Council had essentially stamped on all of humanity 200 years ago. Impossible to model, impossible to predict, impossible to integrate. "Hello," I thought, "nice to meet you too." The drone went quiet after that. Its movement pattern changed. It was no longer simply following us. It was moving in a way that suggested it was transmitting elsewhere, sending a report. I did not try to interfere with that. Let it report. That was what I had expected. That was, in fact, what I had planned for. What I had not planned for was how quickly the response came. 4 hours and 17 minutes after the drone first found us, a Council patrol ship dropped out of faster-than-light transit, approximately 900 km from the Perseverance. My crew saw it before I did. My pilot, a young man named Dan Cole, who had the nerves of a glacier and the reflexes of something much faster, announced it in the same even voice he used to announce everything. "Ship at bearing 47. It is very large." He was not wrong. It was a Veth cruiser. I knew the design from the technical archives the breach corps had assembled from intercepted Council signals over the past century. The Veth were one of the Council's primary peacekeeping species, tall, multi-limbed, with a natural biology that gave them excellent spatial reasoning and made them formidable operators of complex multi-system vessels. Their cruisers were roughly 800 m long, carried crew of over 400, and were equipped with weapon systems that could disable or destroy a vessel the size of the Perseverance without significant effort. They outnumbered us, outweighed us, and outgunned us by any measure that existed. I straightened in my seat, adjusted the collar of my jacket, took a breath. Dan said, "Should I run?" I said, "No, open a channel." The channel opened. There was a moment of silence on both ends. I had spent 3 years preparing for this conversation. I had practiced it in my head at night. When I could not sleep, I had argued with myself about the opening line more times than I could count. In the end, I said, "This is Commander Alara Vass of the Perseverance, representing the unified Earth. Authority, we are traveling in open space and do not intend harm to any vessel or crew. We request contact." The silence lasted 8 seconds. Then a voice came through. It was translated by our system in real time, a function Nora had built into our communications array using 2 centuries of intercepted council transmissions as a reference base. The voice was deep, measured, and carried the particular quality of someone choosing every word very deliberately. It said, "You are outside the designated quarantine zone. Under Council Resolution 447, you are required to return to the interior of the veil immediately." I had been waiting for that. I pulled up the file I had prepared. It was 412 pages long. I did not read all 412 pages. Over the comm, I read one paragraph, specifically Article 9, Clause 4 of the original Quarantine Treaty, which stated that the supply relay obligation of the Galactic Council was to be maintained on an uninterrupted 8-year cycle. Then I noted, in the same calm voice I had been practicing for 3 years, that the supply relay had been skipped entirely in years 40, 48, 88, 104, 160, 172, and 191. That 7 of the scheduled 25 supply cycles had simply not happened, and that Article 17 of the same treaty specified that material breach of council obligations rendered the treaty framework void. I paused. I said, "We're happy to provide the full documentation. It is 412 pages. I can transmit it now, or you can take our word for it. Either way, the treaty is void, which means the quarantine has no legal standing, which means we are standing in open, unowned space with every right to be here that any other free vessel in the galaxy has." The channel stayed open. I could hear faintly voices on the other end, not words, just the sound of several people talking at once in a way that suggested they were not having a calm conversation. Dan looked at me from the pilot's seat. His expression said, "You knew about the supply skips?" I mouthed yes. He looked back at his console. The ghost of something that might have been a smile crossed his face. The Veth captain came back on the line. After 4 minutes and 40 seconds, when he spoke, his voice had changed. It was still measured, but there was something underneath it that had not been there before, something careful. He said, "The council will need to review this claim." I said, "Of course, we are prepared to cooperate fully with a review. We would also request that any review include a full accounting of the missed supply cycles and the resulting resource deficits experienced by the human population during those periods. We have documentation on those as well." Another pause. He said, "I am required to notify the council." I said, "Please do." The channel closed. I sat back in my seat. Dan looked at me. Again, Nara was standing in the doorway. Again, the coffee long since gone cold. The rest of the crew had quietly gathered in the corridor behind her. At some point during the exchange, 6 people in a hallway waiting. My medical officer, a calm and precise woman named Helen Ford, said, "Did that work?" I said, "We will know in a few days." What I did not say, because it would have been unkind to pilot on them all at once, was that the legal argument was not the point. The legal argument was a door opener. It created enough uncertainty, enough procedural obligation on the council's side that they could not simply act without thinking. It bought time. It forced a conversation. The real argument was not going to happen in this corridor. It was going to happened in the council chamber on Verith Prime, and I intended to be there when it did. The council chamber on Verith Prime was built to impress. I say this not as a compliment, I say it as an observation about what the architecture was designed to accomplish. The ceiling rose 40 m above the main floor. The walls were made from a material that absorbed sound at the edges and amplified it at the center, meaning that anything said at the speaking platform carried to every corner of the room with perfect clarity. The seats for the council members were arranged in a rising arc, 400 positions, organized by species and seniority. The speaking platform was a circle of white stone about 3 m in diameter, positioned so that whoever stood on it was visible to every seat. Simultaneously, it was very deliberately a space designed to make whoever was speaking feel small. I had spent 2 days on Verith Prime. Before being admitted to the chamber, I was given a room in what functioned as a diplomatic holding facility, clean and comfortable, and was interviewed by 3 separate council representatives, who each asked slightly different versions of the same basic questions. How had we exited the veil? What were our intentions? Who had authorized this action? I answered all 3 with the same patient honesty, keeping my files available, citing specific provisions, never raising my voice. On the 3rd day, I received a formal notification that the council would hear my address. The invitation specified that I could bring a delegation. I showed up alone. This was, I learned afterward, not what they had expected. The council had prepared for a group. They had seating arranged for up to 12. The sight of a single person crossing that enormous floor toward the speaking platform apparently caused a brief and somewhat notable disruption in the chamber, with several representatives speaking simultaneously in their respective languages, and at least one automated procedural system flagging the situation as anomalous. I did not hurry. The chamber was designed to make a person feel small, but that only works if you consent to it. I walked at my normal pace. I was wearing my standard issue Perseverance jacket, which was gray with the Earth Unified Authority patch on the left shoulder. I had a data pad under my arm. I had, due to an oversight, I never bothered correcting a cup of coffee in my other hand that I had been drinking on my way across the receiving area and had not found a place to sit down. I set it on the edge of the speaking platform. It sat there for the entirety of my address. The chamber head, a Veth representative named Council Chair Davian, called the session to order. He informed me, in a tone that was professionally neutral but not particularly warm, that I had been granted 20 minutes to address the council, and that this address was not to be construed as recognition of any claim or status on behalf of the human species. I said, understood, thank you. Then I began. I did not talk about the legal argument. First, I had already made the legal argument in space, and the council's legal analysts had been working on it. For 4 days, they knew the treaty violations were real. Several of the representatives in this chamber had been in their positions long enough to have known about the missed supply cycles. When they happened, the legal argument had already done its work. It did not need repeating. Instead, I told them a story. I told them about a woman named Diana Vass, who spent 50 years studying a wall that everyone said could not be opened. I told them about the children who grew up in the breach corps, who learned physics the same way other children learned to ride bicycles, because it was just the background of daily life. I told them about the long disagreement and how it ended, not with a treaty or a surrender, but with a respiratory illness that reminded 15 governments they needed each other. I told them about the moment the veil went transparent and my mother sat down on the laboratory floor. I kept my voice even throughout. I did not perform emotion. And GT snorts. And GT, I reported it the way a scientist reports data. Here is what happened. Here is what it meant. Then I showed them what we had built. My second data transfer, which I had pre-cleared with the council communications team, went out to every display terminal in the chamber simultaneously. It was not a list. It was not a report. It was a visual summary of 200 years of human development organized by field, with parallel comparison points to known galactic developmental timelines. In energy science, humanity had surpassed the galactic median at year 112. In materials engineering, at year 131. In medical science, in year 144. We had developed treatments for 11 conditions that had no known solution in the galactic medical catalog. We had developed those treatments without any access to that catalog, working entirely from first principles and internal research. One of those 11 conditions was a degenerative neural illness that had affected the Caith population for 4 decades. I paused after that one. I said we did not know we had solved it until we compared our research to galactic records after crossing the veil. Our xenobiologist, Dr. Me Holland, developed the treatment framework as part of a broader study on accelerated cellular repair. She is 28 years old. She has never met a member of any species other than her own, and she solved a problem your best researchers have been working on for 40 years. I looked up at the Caith section of the Council Arc, 7 representatives, seated in their characteristic tight cluster, all of them very still. I said, she is on the Perseverance right now waiting. She would like to share her research with your medical institute at your convenience. The chamber was quiet in a way that was different from the formal quiet of procedure. It was the quiet of a room that had stopped expecting what was happening. I continued. Dr. Holland was not the only specialist on my crew. I introduced them one by one, each with a name and a skill set, and a specific concrete thing they had brought across the veil. Peter Shaw, my engineer, had developed a theoretical model for slowing stellar hydrogen loss in aging main sequence stars that had potential application to a problem the Sorvi had been facing for 3 generations, namely the gradual deterioration of their home stars. Output. Cal Reed, my communications officer, spoke 9 languages, 6 of which he had taught himself from 2 centuries of intercepted broadcasts, and had developed a new framework for cross-species signal translation that was already demonstrably more accurate than the current council standard. And then there was Lily Novick. Lily was 20 years old. She was not originally on the crew manifest. She had joined 11 days before launch at the recommendation of 3 separate breach corps directors who had all said some version of, you need to meet this person. Lily had grown up in the Eastern European Administrative Zone, the Daughter of two historians, she was not. A scientist, she was not an engineer. She was a diplomat, though she had never been given that title officially because she was too young to hold one. She had spent her adolescence studying every alien culture that humanity had managed to piece together from intercepted signals and archival records. She spoke to people of every background and temperament in a way that made them feel that their concerns had been heard and taken seriously. She was also, as I pointed out to the council, the person who had spent the past 4 days in the diplomatic holding facility making friends with every single member of the support staff, kitchen crew, and maintenance team in the building. This produced a brief but notable reaction in several council members, particularly those who had spoken with their staff that morning and gotten an unexpected and favorable report about the human visitor. I was not trying to manipulate them. And GT snorts. And GT, I want to be clear about that. Lily was not deployed as a tactic, she was just Lily, and this was just what she did. The point I was making was larger than any individual on my crew. The point was that we had not come to the council chamber to ask for anything, we had come to offer something. 200 years of isolation had not stunted humanity, it had concentrated us. We had taken every problem we had, every resource limitation, every political friction, every scientific challenge, and we had worked on all of it without stopping, without outside help, without the benefit of the galactic community that had decided, without asking us, that we were better kept separate. And what we had produced in that isolation was a civilization that could contribute something real to the galaxy, that had tried to contain it. I said, you sealed us in because you could not predict us. I understand that. Unpredictability is uncomfortable, but unpredictability is not the same as danger. You looked at our history and saw chaos. What you were actually seeing was adaptation. We solve problems differently from every other species here because we had to, and that difference is not a threat to galactic order. It is a resource you have been locking away for 2 centuries. I looked along the council arc. I said, we are not asking to be trusted immediately. We are not asking for full membership or political standing or any kind of fast track to integration. We are asking for the opportunity to demonstrate over time that the model you built of us 200 years ago was incomplete. We are asking for a conversation, a real one, the kind that should have happened before the veil ever went up. The Drenathi representative, a tall figure in formal council robes who had been sitting rigidly upright since I entered the chamber, leaned forward and said something in their own language. The translation came through my earpiece. As this species has demonstrated a capacity for strategic presentation that should itself be considered a risk factor. I looked at them directly. I said, with respect, Counselor, you just described almost every successful diplomat in history. I will take it as a compliment. The chamber noise that followed was by the accounts of the support staff who told Lily about it later, the most audible the council session had been in 11 years. The vote on the Drenathi motion to reseal the veil was called 2 hours. Later it failed. The margin was not close. The counter-proposal put forward by the Sorvi representative was for a provisional framework called observed sovereign status, a classification that had never existed in galactic law. Before, it recognized humanity as a sovereign species operating outside the quarantine zone under an agreed set of conditions, with a 5-year review period and the possibility of full status pending demonstrated integration. It passed. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, the Keth delegation stopped me. 7 of them moving with the particular coordinated efficiency of their species, surrounding me in a loose circle. Their lead representative, figure whose name translated approximately to senior voice of the Biological Ethics Committee, stood directly in front of me. They were silent for a moment. Then they said, "You're Dr. Holland. We would like to speak with her immediately." I said, "She is expecting your call." They moved away at speed. I watched them go. Helen Ford appeared at my elbow. She had been waiting outside the chamber for the entire session. She said, "How did it go?" I said, "We have a 5-year review and a status category. They invented this afternoon to describe us." She thought about this for a moment. She said, "Is that good?" I said, "It means they do not have a word for what we are yet. That is exactly where I want to be." 6 days after the council vote, I took a shuttle alone to the edge of the Veil. I filed a solo flight plan, which caused some raised procedural flags at the Verith Prime Transit Authority, because the concept of a single-person vessel with no designated destination was apparently not common in council space. I explained that I needed to visit a specific location for personal reasons. This produced a longer silence than I expected, followed by a quiet authorization, which I suspected came from somewhere higher than the standard transit office. The flight to the Veil took 11 hours at the shuttle's modest speed. I did not mind. I needed the time. I spent the first 4 hours reviewing the provisional framework documentation line by line, the way my mother had taught me to read anything important, not for what it said on the surface, but for what it assumed underneath. Every legal document has assumptions built into it, unspoken premises about how the world works, and those assumptions matter as much as the words. The observed sovereign status framework assumed several things about humanity. It assumed we would continue to operate from a fixed base, meaning our solar system. It assumed our development curve would stabilize as we integrated with galactic norms. It assumed our population of leadership, meaning those of us who had crossed the Veil, was representative of the species as a whole. All 3 of those assumptions were going to prove interesting in the coming years. Our solar system was our origin, not our limit. The Perseverance had crossed the Veil once. It would cross again, and it would not be alone for long. In the months between the initial breach and our departure, the breach core had been preparing a second ship, then a third. The Unified Earth Authority had already commissioned a full program of Veil transition vessels. I was one ship. I was a forerunner. Behind me, humanity was already moving. Our development curve was not going to stabilize the way the council expected. When you have spent 200 years solving problems from scratch with no outside resources and no established solutions to borrow, you develop a relationship with problem solving that does not simply turn off when better tools become available. Ms. Holland was not going to stop working when she gained access to the galactic medical database. She was going to add the galactic medical database to everything she already knew and come up with something nobody expected. This was true across every field represented on my crew, and my crew was 7 people. Earth had 8 billion. And as for representativeness, I was 31 years old, born into a specialist program, trained from childhood for a mission most people thought was impossible. The council was inferring the character of an entire civilization from a commander and 6 crew members. I was not a typical human. None of us on the Perseverance were, but I was also not so different from the people I had left behind that the council's model would hold. What the council was going to discover over the coming years was that the qualities they found surprising in me were not unusual. They were widespread. They were systemic. They were the product of 200 years of a particular kind of pressure applied to a particular kind of species. We were not a delegation. We were a sample. I thought about all of this for a long time. The shuttle's navigation system chimed softly at hour 9. I looked up. The veil was visible ahead, a faint shimmer across the star field, almost imperceptible unless you knew exactly what to look for. I knew I had crossed it once from the inside. Coming at it from the outside felt different in a way I had not anticipated. From inside, the veil had been a barrier, the thing between us and everything else. From outside it looked different. It looked like what it was, a membrane, a boundary between 2 states of being, not a wall, not a cage, just the line between before and after. I matched speed to nothing in particular and drifted to a stop about a kilometer from the surface. The veil hummed. I could hear it through the hull, that low resonance that the breach core had spent decades studying. My mother had spent her career listening to this sound. She had mapped it, cataloged it, found the patterns inside it that nobody else had recognized as patterns. She had learned its language when everyone else was trying to overwhelm it. I took the case from my wrist. It was small, smooth, sealed with a simple magnetic clasp that I had not opened since the morning after she died. Her colleague, a physicist named George Alderman, had prepared it for me at the end. He had not said anything when he handed it over. He had just held it out to me with both hands very carefully, and I had taken it the same way. I held it for a moment. Then I opened the external hatch on the shuttle's port side. Not a full breach of pressure, just a narrow sample collection port designed for atmospheric testing. I had modified it slightly before leaving Verith Prime. I said aloud to no one in particular, "Half of you belongs here." Where the answer was, I released the first portion through the port. It dispersed immediately in the vacuum, scattering into the empty space between the shuttle and the veil's surface, invisible in seconds, present everywhere. I turned the shuttle through the cockpit glass. The veil stretched across the star field behind me, and beyond it, invisible but not absent, was home. I said, "And half of you belongs there." Where the question started, I released the rest through the forward port into the space between me and the interior of the sealed zone. The veil hummed. I sat in the quiet for a while after that. There is a particular feeling that comes after a very long effort reaches its end. Not triumph, not relief, something quieter and harder to name, a kind of recognition of the distance traveled and the cost of it, of snorts the people who did not make it to the finish line, and deserve to, of the weight that has been carried for so long that when it is finally set down, you can feel the shape of it in the absence. I had been carrying something that was larger than my own grief for my mother, though her loss was real and present, and would take a long time to become something I could look at directly. I had been carrying the weight of what had been done to all of us, the 200 years of sealed sky, the generations of people who lived and died inside a boundary that was not of their making, who built what they built, not because it was easy, but because it was the only thing to do. They deserved to have someone cross the line, someone carry the record of what they had made, someone stand in the council chamber and say clearly and without apology, look at what we did. Look at what we became. Look at what you missed. I had done that. My crew had done that. And we were only 7 people. Behind us, 8 billion people were watching. The veil was still standing for now, but the breach core had 3 more ships in preparation. The unified Earth Authority was in the process of establishing a diplomatic office on Verith Prime, with Lily Novik as its first informal liaison at her own insistence, and to the visible relief of the Council support staff, who apparently adored her already. Meheland was in a laboratory on Verith Prime's main medical campus, working alongside a Keth research team, exchanging data at a pace that both sides described as slightly overwhelming. Peter Shaw had been invited to present his stellar stabilization model to a Sorvey academic panel, and it sent me a message saying, simply, they want to fund it. What do I say? I had replied, say yes, then ask for more resources. Cal Reed was negotiating quietly and without drama the terms of the first direct communication channel between Earth and a Council member species. It was not official, it was not sanctioned yet by the full framework review, but the Keth had asked and Cal had said yes before checking with anyone, which was very Cal, and I had decided after the fact that it was the right call. Dan Cole was orbiting Verith Prime in the Perseverance, doing maintenance, reading old navigation charts, and waiting with the patient certainty of someone who knew the work was not finished. Helen Ford was writing a comparative medical analysis of 7 species biological systems that she had been collecting data for since we first crossed the veil, methodically, in whatever hours she was not sleeping or eating, because Helen operated that way. 7 people, 7 different skills, 7 different ways of being human. The Council had sealed us in because they could not predict us 200 years later. We had crossed their barrier, not with weapons, not with force, not with any of the catastrophic scenarios their models had generated. We had crossed it with a frequency pattern, a 400-page legal document, a xenobiologist with a medical breakthrough, an engineer with a solution to a dying star, a communications officer who taught himself alien languages from intercepted static, a pilot with the calm of deep water, a doctor who cataloged everything she saw, a 20-year-old diplomat who made friends with maintenance crews on first contact planets, and a cup of coffee I had forgotten to put down. We were unpredictable, they had said so. They had built a wall around us because of it. But what is unpredictability really? It is the failure of a model. It means the model was wrong, not the thing it was trying to model. The Council's model of Humanity had been built from 11 years of observation before any human being had ever spoken a word to an alien species. They had watched from a distance and drawn conclusions and made a decision that affected billions of people, and they had been so certain of their model that it had never seriously occurred to them to question it. They had not asked us what we were, they had decided. And in deciding, they had locked us in a pressure chamber and left us there for 200 years. We had used every second of it. I looked at the veil for a long time. The hum was still present, steady, familiar. I had spent my whole life inside it without ever touching it. It had been the ceiling, the horizon, the limit of everything known. Now I was on the other side, and it looked exactly the same from here as I imagined it did. From the inside, a shimmer of boundary, a reminder of a time that was ending. I thought about the 5-year review. I thought about all the things the council was going to discover over those 5 years that their provisional framework had not accounted for. I thought about the conversations that were coming, some of which were going to be genuinely difficult, some of which were going to surprise everyone, including me. I was not naive enough to think the next chapter was simple. Trust takes time. Integration takes longer. There would be conflicts and misunderstandings and species in that council chamber who were never going to be comfortable with the way humans approach the world. That was fine. We did not need everyone to love us. We needed space to show what we were. We had space now, open space, unowned, available to anyone with a ship and the courage to move. I turned the shuttle, set the heading back toward Verith Prime, back toward the Perseverance, back toward everything that came next. The veil fell behind me as I accelerated away. I did not look back at it, not because I wanted to forget it, because there was no need to look back at something that had already made you what you were. The council feared our return. I understood why. They had sealed something in, and what had come out was not what they put in. That gap between what they expected and what they got was what frightened them. What they had not yet understood, and what they were going to spend the coming years learning, was that the gap was not a threat. The gap was the point. We were not the same species they had sealed away. We were what that species became when it was given 200 years and no choice but to be extraordinary. The stars ahead were clear and countless, every one of them reachable, every one of them now within the compass of what humanity could become. I opened a channel to the Perseverance. Dan answered in his characteristic half second. I said, I am on my way back. Get the crew together. We have work to do. He said, already waiting. I smiled. The throttle went forward. The shuttle climbed toward the stars. Behind me, in the quiet between the ship and the veil, 2 small dispersed clouds of ash drifted in opposite directions, one toward the sealed zone, one toward the open galaxy. My mother, as I had promised her, had reached somewhere the veil could not touch. The rest was ours to write.